Hello, good afternoon. This is Michal Kryzanowski from WHO. I will talk about WHO guidelines for indoor air quality, focusing on selected pollutants considered by the guidelines. As some of you may know, the guidelines are one of the creating the health-related guidelines is one of the core activities of WHO. We have guidelines on air quality, on water, drinking water, recreational waters, several sets of guidelines on various chemicals, foods, components, and so on. So it's one of the core activities to create the guidelines. The aim of the guidelines is to provide a uniform basis for the protection of public health from adverse effects of indoor exposure to air pollution, and in a broader sense, to eliminate or reduce to a minimum exposure to those pollutants that are known or are likely to be hazardous. Well, most of you know that the scope of the indoor air quality problems is very wide, and addressing, formulating the guidelines is also a quite tricky business. So the first step in creating the indoor air quality guidelines was to ask experts how to approach this very broad subject. And the experts who met back in 2006 advised WHO to look at this problem of indoor air quality and preparation of the guidelines in three broad categories. The first category was to address selected pollutants, specific chemicals or groups of chemicals which are known to be hazardous, which are known to be present in indoor spaces, in residential buildings or offices, and to formulate guidelines for those pollutants. Second group was addressing biological agents, and here the focus was on dampness and mold, addressing, as a matter of fact, the determinant of those biological agents in indoor spaces rather than individual microbes and biological species, which thousands of which are present in indoor air. And second group out of biological agents were allergens from dust, house mites, and pets in particular. The third group of pollutants in indoor air are coming from indoor combustion or from household fuel combustion. And the preparatory meeting advised WHO to address this issue from the perspective of technology used for use of household fuels, and the creation of those guidelines is going on. So the first group of subjects dealing with chemicals was analyzed, prepared, and published in 2010. All 9 pollutants except particulate matter are covered in the specific volume of indoor air quality guidelines, with particulate matter available already in the Air Quality Guidelines Global Update 2005 due to the decision to keep the guidelines identical with let's call it ambient air quality guidelines. Guidelines for dampness and mold were published in 2009, and guidelines on indoor combustion of household fuels are being developed now, and we hope to have the guidelines published more or less in a year's time. The process, specifically the guidelines on indoor air do not address secondhand smoke. This is already more than 10 years ago. It was established by WHO. There no safe exposure level exists, and we should emphasize that all those indoor pollutants which are considering are in conditions which where the second-hand smoke is actually eliminated already from indoor spaces. The process of guidelines formulation involved a systematic review of literature, the scientific evidence dealing with assessing health effects of indoor air pollutants. Then, based on this literature, the most relevant studies and data on effects were identified, looking at strength of evidence, at effects on vulnerable populations, and looking at relevance for indoor air exposure. This information was looked together with information on mechanisms of action of those chemicals and with evidence on current outdoor and indoor levels of those pollutants in the air. Based on this review of evidence, guidelines were formulated by consensus of the working group gathered in Bonn in 2009, and each of the sentences of the guidelines is, and of course the guidelines level, if available, were based on identification of the strength of evidence, critical health outcomes, existence or non-existence of no observed adverse effects levels, and looking at the mechanisms of the effects. I will give example of a few of the guidelines. For instance, the first one is looking at formaldehyde, and it is well established that formaldehyde is non-genotoxic carcinogen, classified by IARC Group 1, and WHO guidelines, indoor quality guidelines of 100 micrograms per cubic meter, measured as 30 minutes average, is designed to prevent acute sensory effects. Since this level is lower than any threshold proposed by IARC or an observed level proposed by IARC, this level is also preventing potential risk of cancer. However, when we look at the current levels of formaldehyde in houses in various European countries, we see that the guideline level is not met in substantial part of houses, especially in United Kingdom and in Austria. So there are houses, normal houses, where guidelines are exceeded even in recent days. For benzene, benzene represents pollutant for which there is no threshold because it is a genotoxic carcinogen. At each level of exposure, we expect a certain risk to occur, and the guidelines formulate the magnitude of the risk at various concentration or various exposure level. So, for instance, at exposure of 17 micrograms per cubic meter, the long-term exposure is is associated with the risk of 1 per 10,000 of leukemia. When we look again at the distribution of benzene in homes in the world, then we see that the distribution is quite wide, but is certainly in the range where we can expect more than 1 per 10,000 cases of leukemia being associated with indoor exposure to benzene. When we look at the right of the screen, we can see that this level of exposure is very clearly related to existence of tobacco smoke in the house. It's much higher in houses where tobacco smoke is present. So the first step to reduce the exposure to benzene is to reduce or eliminate actually exposure to environmental tobacco smoke. It's formulated besides the old and well-known levels for relatively short-term exposures, preventing accidental poisoning, also create guideline for long-term exposure, which actually is quite often the level of 7 milligrams per cubic meter is not uncommon in the houses and may create more chronic health effects. So we considered several other pollutants. The guidelines give both critical outcomes and levels of those pollutants and recommendations that houses should stay below the levels indicated in the guidelines. There is further work which is necessary to complete the protection of indoor air from several pollutants. There is a long list of chemicals which were considered as potentially hazardous in indoor air, but back in 2006 the conclusion was that the current scientific evidence is still insufficient to give a solid basis for indoor air quality guidelines, and therefore this was the work on those pollutants has been postponed for later, and we'll need to look when this later will be. And I think this is the end of my presentation on the present indoor air quality guidelines on selected pollutants. Thank you.